Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, page 87. 30 April, year of the Depend adult undergarment. He sat alone above the desert, redly backlit and framed in shale, watching very yellow payloaders crawl over the beaten dirt of some USA construction site several kilometers to the southeast. The outcropping's height allowed him, Morath, to look out over most of USA area code 6026. His shadow did not yet reach the downtown regions of the city Tucson. Not yet quite. Of sounds in the arid hush were only a faint and occasional hot wind, the blurred sound of the wings of sometimes an insect, some tentative trickling of loosened grit and small stones moving farther down the upslope behind, and as well the sunset over the foothills and mountains behind him. Such a difference from the watery and somehow sad spring sunsets of southwest Quebec's Pampano regions, where his wife had need of care. This, the sunset, more resembled an explosion. It took place above and behind him, and he turned some of the time to regard it. The sunset was swollen and perfectly round and large, radiating knives of light when he squinted. It hung and trembled slightly, like a viscous drop about to fall. It hung just above the peaks of the Tortolita foothills behind him, Morath, and slowly was sinking. Morath sat alone and blanket-lapped in his customized fauteuil de roulant on a kind of outcropping or shelf about halfway up, waiting, amusing himself with his shadow. As the lowering light from behind came at an angle more and more acute, Goethe's well-known Brockengespenst phenomenon enlarged and distended his seated shadow far out over land, so that the spokes of his chair's rear wheels cast over two whole counties below gigantic asterisk shadows, whose fine black radial lines he could cause to move by playing slightly with the wheel's rubber rims, and his head shadow brought to much of the suburb West Tucson a premature dusk. He appeared to remain concentrated on his huge shadow play as gravel and then also breath sounded from the steep hillside back above him, grit and dirty stones cascading onto the outcropping and gushing past his chair and off the front lip, and then the unmistakable yelp of an individual's impact with a cactus somewhere up behind. But Morath, he had all the time, without turning, watched the other man's clumsy sliding descent's own mammoth shadow, cast as far east as the Rincon Range, just past the city Tucson, and could see the shadow rush in west toward his own as unspecified services M. Hugh steeply descended, falling twice and cursing in USA English, until the shadow collapsed nearly into Morath's monstrous own. Another yelp took place as the unspecified services field operatives fall and slide. The last several meters carried him upon his bottom, down onto the outcropping, and then nearly all the way out and off it, Morath having to release the machine pistol under his blanket to grab Steepley's bare arm and halt this sliding. Steepley's skirt was pulled obscenely up, and his hosiery full of runs and stubs of thorns. The operative sat at Morath's feet, glowing redly in the backlight, legs hanging over the shelf's edge, breathing with difficulty. Morath smiled and released the operative's arm. "Stealth becomes you," he said. "Go shit in your chapeau," Steepley wheezed, bringing up his legs to survey the hosiery's damage. They spoke for the most part USA English when they met like this, covertly in the field. M. Fortier had wished Morath to require that they interface always in Quebecois French, as for a small symbolic concession to the AFR on the part of the Office of Unspecified Services, which the Quebecois separatist left referred to always as BSS, the Bureau de Service Sans Spécificité. Morath watched a column of shadow spread again out east over the desert's floor, as Steeply got a hand under himself and rose, a huge, well-fed figure tottering on heels. The two men sat together, a strange Brockenspence shadow out toward the city Tucson, a shadow round and radial at the base and jagged at the top, from Steeply's wig becoming uncombed in his descent. Steeply's gigantic prosthetic breasts pointed in wildly different directions now, one nearly at the empty sky. The matte curtain of sunset's true dusk shadow was moving itself very slowly in across the Rincons and Sonora Desert east of the city Tucson, still many kilometers from obscuring their own large shadow. But once Maroth had committed not just to pretend to betray his assassins du Fortu Roland in order to secure advanced medical care for the medical needs of his wife, but to do in truth this: betray perfidiously, now pretending only to M. Fortier and his AFR superiors that he was merely pretending to feed some betraying information to BSS. Once this decision, Maroth was without all power, served now at the pleasures of the power of Steeply and the BSS of Hugh Steeply, and now they spoke mostly the USA English of Steeply's preference. In fact, Steeply's Quebecois was better than Maroth's English, but c'était la guerre, as one says. Maroth sniffed slightly, thus. So, we now are both here. He wore a windbreaker and did not perspire. Steeply's eyes were luridly lit up. The rear area of his dress was dirty. Some of his makeup had started to run. He was forming a type of salute to shade his eyes, looking upward behind them at what remained of the explosive and trembling sun. How in God's name did you get up here? Maroth slowly shrugged. As usual, he appeared to Steeply as if he were half asleep. He ignored the question and said, only shrugging, "My time is finite." Steeply had also with him a woman's handbag or purse. "And the wife?" he said, gazing upward as yet. "How's the wife doing?" "Holding her own weight, thank you," Maroth said. His tone of voice betrayed nothing. "And so, thus, what is it your officers believe they wish to know?" Steeply tottered on a leg as he removed one shoe and poured from it grit. "Nothing terribly surprising. A bit of razzle-dazzle up northeast in your so-called ops area." "Certainly you heard." Maroth sniffed. A large odor of inexpensive and high-alcohol perfume came not from Steeply's person, but from his handbag, which failed to complement his shoes. Maroth said, "Dazzle?" "As in a civilian-type individual receives a certain item, don't tell me this is news to you guys. Not on Interlace Pulse, this item arrives via normal physical mail. We're sure you heard, Remy. A cartridge copy of a certain, let's call it, between ourselves, the entertainment. As in the mail, without warning or motive. Out of the blue." "From somewhere blue?" The BSS operative had perspired also through his rouge, and his mascara had melted to become whorish. "A person with no political value to anybody except that the Saudi Ministry of Entertainment made one the hell of a shrill stink." "The medical attaché, the specialist of digesting you refer to," Maroth shrugged again in the maddening francophone way that can mean several things. "Your offices wish to ask what was the entertainment's cartridge disseminated through our mechanisms?" "Don't let's waste your finite time, ami, oh friend," Steeply said. "The mischief happens to occur in metropolitan Boston. Postal codes route the packet through the desert southwest, and we know your dissemination scheme's routing mechanism is proposed for somewhere between Phoenix and the border down here." Steeply had worked hard at feminizing his expressions and gesturing. He would be a bit starry-eyed of OUS, not to think of your distinguished self. "No?" Beneath Maroth's windbreaker was a sport shirt whose breast pocket was filled with many pens. He said, "Us. We don't have the information on even casualties from this blue dazzle you speak of." Steeply was trying to extract something stubborn from inside his other shoe. "Upwards of 20, Remy. Out of commission altogether. The attaché and his wife. The wife, a Saudi citizen. 4 more raggers, all with embassy cards. A couple neighbors or something. The rest, mostly police, before word got to a level they could stop police from going in before they killed the power." "Local police forces, gendarmes." "The local constabulary. The minions of the law of the land. The local constabulary were, shall we say, unprepared for an entertainment like this." Steeply even removed and replaced his pumps in the upright on one leg, bringing other foot up behind his bottom way of a feminine USA woman. But he appeared huge and bloated as a woman, not merely unattractive, but inducing something like sexual despair. He said, "The attaché had diplomatic status, Remy. Mid-East, Saudi. Said to be close to minor members of the royal family." Marath sniffed hard, as if congested of the nose. "Puzzling," he said, "but also a compatriot of yours, Canadian citizenship, born in Ottawa, to Arab emigres, visa lists of residence in Montreal, and services without specificity, wishes maybe to ask, were there below-the-surface connections that make the individual not such a civilian, unconnected? To ask of us, would the AFR wish to make of him the example?" Steeply was removing dirt from his bottom, swatting himself on the bottom. He stood more or less directly over Marath. Marath sniffed. "We have neither digestive medicals nor diplomatic entourages on any lists for action. You have personally seen AFR's initial lists, nor in particular Montreal civilians. We have, as one will say, larger seafood to cook." Steeply was looking out over the desert and city, also as he swatted at himself. He seemed to have noticed the Jest phenomenon of his own shadow. Marath, for some reason, pretended again to sniff the nose. The wind was moderate and constant, and about the temperature of a USA clothes dryer set on low. It made the shrill whistling sounds, also sounds of the blowing grit. Weeds of tumbling like enormous hairballs rolled often across the interstate highway of I-10, far below. Their specular perspective, the reddening light on vast tan stone and the oncoming curtain of dusk, the further elongation of their monstrous agate shadows, all was almost mesmerizing. Neither man seemed able to look at anything but the vista below. Marath could simultaneously speak in English and think in French. The desert was the tawny color of the hide of the lion. They were speaking without looking at one another, facing both the same direction. This gave their conversing an air of careless intimacy, as of old friends at the cartridge viewer together, or a long-married couple. Marath thought this as he opened and closed his upheld hand, making over the city Tucson a huge and black blossom open itself and close itself. And Steeply raised his bare arms and held them out and crossed them, maybe as if signaling for distant aid. This made X's and pendative V's over much in the city Tucson. But still, Remy, born in the hated bayou Ottawa, this civilian attaché, and connected to a major buyer of trans-grid entertainment, and follow up out of the Boston offices reports possible indications of the victim's prior possible involvement with the widow of the auteur we both know was responsible for the entertainment in the first place. The samizdat. Prior? Steeply produced from his handbag Belgian cigarettes of a many and habitually female type. Film director's wife taught out at Brandeis, where the victim done his residency. The husband was on board over at AEC's, and different agency background checks indicated the wife was fucking just about everything with a pulse, with the slight pause of which Steepley could excel, particularly a Canadian pulse. Involvement of sexuality is what you are meaning then, not politics. Steepley said this wife herself, a Québécois, Remy, from Leslie County. Chief Tyne says 3 years spent on Ottawa's Personnes qui on doit list. There's such a thing as political sex. I have to say to you, all we know, civilians as individual warnings to ONAN are not our desire. This is known by you. Marath's eyes looked nearly closed. And your tits, they have become cockeyed. I will tell you, services without specificity, they have given you ridiculous tits, and now they point differently. Steepley looked down at himself. One of the false breasts, surely false, surely they would not go so far as the hormonal, Marath thought, nearly touched the chins of Steepley when his looking down produced his double chins. I was asked to secure personal verification is all, he said. My general sense at the office is the brass consider the whole incident a stumper. There's theories and counter-theories. There are even anti-theories, positing error, mistaken identity, sick hoax. His shrugging with his hands on the prosthesis appeared not at all Gallic. Still, 23 human beings lost for all time. That'd be some hoax, no? Marath sniffed. Asked to verify by our mutual M. Tyne. How you call him? Rod a God? Rodney Tyne, Sr., Chief of Unspecified Services, acknowledged architect of ONAN and Continental Reconfiguration, who held the ear of the White House of USA and whose stenographer had long doubled as the stenographer cum Jean-Phil de Vendredi of M. Duplessis, former assistant coordinator of the Pan-Canadian Resistance, and whose passionate, ill-disguised attachment, Tyne's, to this double amanuensis won Mademoiselle Luria Perec of Level Loyalties of Tyne, whether he doubled for Quebec out of the love for Luria, or tripled the loyalties, pretending only to divulge secrets while secretly maintaining his USA fealty against the pull of an irresistible love, it was said. The Remy. It was clear that Steepley could not fix his breast's directions without pulling down severely his décolletage, which he was shy to do. He produced from his handbag sunglasses and put on the sunglasses. They were embellished with rhinestones and looked absurd. Rod the God. Marath forced himself to say nothing of their appearance. Steepley tried with several matches to light a cigarette in the wind. The encroachment of true dusk began to erase his wig's chaotic shadow. Electric lights began to twinkle in the Rincon foothills east of the city. Steepley tried somewhat to cup his body around the match for shelter for the flame. It's a herd of feral hamsters, a major herd, thundering across the yellow plains of the southern reaches of the Great Concavity in what used to be Vermont, raising dust that forms a uremic-hued cloud with somatic shapes interpretable from as far away as Boston and Montreal. The herd is descended from 2 domestic hamsters set free by a Watertown, New York boy at the beginning of the experialist migration in the subsidized year of the Whopper. The boy now attends college in Champaign, Illinois, and has forgotten that his hamsters were named Ward and June. The noise of the herd is tornadic, locomotival. The expression on the hamsters' whiskered faces is businesslike and implacable. It's that implacable herd expression. They thunder eastward toward pedal-ferrous terrain that today is fallow, denuded. To the east, dimmed by the fulvous cloud, the hamsters send up is the vivid, verdant, ragged outline of the annularly over-fertilized forests of what used to be central Maine. All these territories are now property of Canada. With respect to a herd of this size, please exercise the sort of common sense that, come to think of it, would keep your thinking man out of the southwest concavity anyway. Feral hamsters are not pets. They mean business. Wide berth advised. Carry nothing even remotely vegetable-ish if in the path of a feral herd. If in the path of such a herd, move quickly and calmly in a direction perpendicular to their own. If American, north, not advisable. Move south, calmly and in all haste, toward some border metropolis, Rome, North New York, or Glen Falls, North New York, or Beverly, Massachusetts, say, or those bordered points between them at which the giant protective ATHSCME fans atop the hugely convex protective walls of anodized lucite hold off the drooling and piss-colored bank of teratogenetic concavity clouds, and move the bank well back, north, away, jaggedly, over your protected head. The heavy-tongued English of Steepley was even more difficult to understand with a cigarette in his mouth. He said, "And you'll of course report this little interface of you and me right back to Fortier." Morath shrugged. "En ce?" Steepley got it lit. He was a large and soft man, some type of brutal U.S. contact sport athlete now become fat. He appeared to Morath to look less like a woman than a twisted parody of womanhood. Electrolysis had caused patches of tiny red pimples along his jowls and upper lip. He also held his elbow out, the arm holding the match for lighting, which is how no woman lights a match, who is used to breasts and keeping the lighting elbow in. Also, Steepley teetered ungracefully on his pump's heels. On the stone's uneven surface, he never for a moment turned his back completely at Morath, as he stood on the lip of the outcropping. And Morath had his chair's wheels clamps now locked down tight, and a firm grip on the machine pistols. Pebbled grip. Steepley's purse was small and glossy black, and the sunglasses he wore had womanly frames, with small, false jewels at the temples. Morath believed that something in Steepley enjoyed his grotesque appearance, and craved the humiliation of the field disguises his BSS superiors requested of him. Steepley now looked at him, in probability, behind the dark glasses, and also that I just right now asked you if you'd report it, and that you said, "Bien sûr." Morath's laugh had this misfortune to sound false and over-hearty, whether or not sincere. He made a mustache of his finger, pretending for some reason to stifle a need to sneeze. "You verify this because of why?" Steepley scratched under the hem of his blonde wig, with stupidly dangerously the thumb of his hand that held the cigarette. "Well, you are already tripling, Remy, aren't you? Or would it be quadrupling? We know Fortier and the AFR know you're here with me now." "But do my brothers on wheels know that you are knowing this? That they have sent me to pretend I double?" Morath's sidearm, a Sterling UL 35 9mm machine pistol with a Magna port silencer, did not have a safety. Its fat and texture of Pebble's grip was hot from Morath's palm, and in turn caused Morath's palm to perspire beneath the blanket. From Steepley, there was merely silence. Morath said, "Have I pretended to pretend to betray?" And the desert USA's light had now become sad, more than half the round sun gone behind the tortolitas. Only now the chair's wheels and Steepley's thick legs cast shadows below the dusk line, and these shadows were becoming squat and retreating back up toward the two men. Steepley did a brief pretend Charleston, playing with his leg shadows. "Nothing personal. You know that. It's the obsessive caution. Who was it who once said we get paid to drive ourselves crazy, the caution thing? You guys in Tyne, your Duplessis, always suspected he tried to hold back on the information he passed sexually to Luria." Morath shrugged hard. "And abruptly, Monsieur Duplessis has now passed away from life, under circumstances of almost ridiculous suspicion." Again, with the false-sounding laugh. "An inept burglary and grip indeed." Both men were silent. Steepley's left arm had on it a nasty mesquite scratch. Marath could observe. Marath finally glanced at his watch, its dial illuminated in his body shadow. Both men's shadows were now climbing the steep incline, returning up to them. Me, I think that we go about our affairs in a more simple manner than your BSS office. If Amtine's betrayal were incomplete, we of Quebec would be aware. Because of Luria? Marath pretended to fuss with his blanket, rearranging it. But yes, the caution, Luria would be aware. Steepley stepped gingerly up to the edge and tossed out his cigarette stub. The wind caught the stub, and it soared slightly upward from his hand, moving east. Both men were silent until the butt fell and hit the dark mountainside. Off, below them, a tiny bloom of orange. Their silence then became contemplative. Something tight in the air between them loosened. Marath no longer felt the sun on his skull. Dusk settled about them. Steepley had found his tricep scratch and twisted the flesh of his arm to examine it. His rouged lips rounded with concern.